Sorry, sir. First-class meals are only for confirmed premium passengers. If you mistakenly came up from another cabin, I need you to return to your assigned seat.
Sir, first-class meals are not available for passengers from economy. The sentence cut through the cabin so sharply that even the man in seat 1C stopped typing on his laptop. A woman near the aisle lowered her wine glass halfway to the table. Someone in the second row quietly pulled their phone from beneath a magazine, and Ethan Brooks just sat there, still, calm, like he had heard things like this before. The cabin lights inside Flight 287 glowed soft amber against polished wood panels and cream leather seats. Outside the window, rain streaked across the runway at Chicago O'Hare, blurring the airport lights into long silver lines. It was almost 8 in the evening. Boarding had just finished. Most passengers in first class already looked settled into their own worlds. Expensive headphones, quiet conversations, tight smiles from people used to getting what they paid for. Ethan did not look like any of them. No tailored designer coat, no flashy watch, no loud confidence, just a dark gray jacket, clean jeans, a worn leather bag tucked carefully beneath the seat in front of him. Melissa Turner stood beside row 2, holding a digital meal tablet against her chest, 32 years old. Blonde hair pulled tight into a professional bun, every movement sharp, efficient, controlled, and right now, irritated. "I'm sorry, sir," she repeated, louder this time. "These meals are assigned to confirmed premium passengers only." Across the aisle, Rachel Kahns looked up from her paperwork, mid-40s, corporate attorney, the kind of woman who noticed details for a living. Her eyes moved from Melissa to Ethan, then down to the boarding pass resting neatly beside his hand. Ethan lifted his gaze slowly. "I am a confirmed premium passenger." His voice was quiet, no anger, no embarrassment. That somehow made the moment worse. Melissa forced a smile that never reached her eyes. "Sir, if there's been a seating mix-up, I can help you return to your assigned cabin before departure." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Nobody spoke, because everyone understood what was happening, and nobody wanted to become part of it. Ethan reached for the folded boarding pass beside him. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately, not defensive, not rushed. Melissa took the pass, seat 2A, first class, confirmed. Purchased 3 weeks earlier. Her eyes scanned it twice, then once more. The facts were clear, but something inside her had already decided this man did not belong in this seat. And once people decide something emotionally, facts often become inconvenient noise. She handed the pass back a little too quickly. "There may be a delay in the boarding system," she said. "Temporary upgrades don't always register immediately." "I wasn't upgraded," Ethan replied. "I bought the seat." The businessman in 1C leaned back deeper into his chair, pretending not to listen now. Rachel Collins stopped pretending entirely. Melissa's jaw tightened. Flight attendants dealt with difficult passengers every day. Loud passengers, drunk passengers, entitled passengers, but calm passengers. Those were harder, because calm forced everyone else to hear the actual word being spoken. The captain's voice echoed gently through the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are waiting on final paperwork and should be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience." Outside, baggage crews moved through the rain beneath flashing orange lights. Inside first class, the tension thickened quietly. Melissa moved to the next row and began taking dinner selections. Short rib, sea bass, wine pairings, professional smiles. Then she skipped Ethan completely. He watched her continue toward row 3, watched her intentionally move past him. Only then did he speak again. "Excuse me." Melissa stopped. Several heads turned immediately. "I believe you skipped my meal selection." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to hear. Melissa inhaled slowly through her nose. Then she stepped closer. "First-class dining service," she said carefully, "is reserved for verified premium guests." Rachel's expression changed instantly. There it was, not loud, not explicit, but unmistakable. Ethan rested both hands lightly on the armrests. "I've already shown you my boarding pass twice, and I'm asking you not to make this difficult, sir." That word, difficult. Rachel had spent 20 years inside boardrooms, hearing that word used against people who challenged humiliation politely. Difficult usually meant, "Stop making us uncomfortable with what we're doing to you." Ethan looked out the rain-streaked window for a moment before turning back toward Melissa. Are you formally denying service to a ticketed first-class passenger? The question landed differently. Too precise, too controlled. Melissa blinked once. People nearby noticed it immediately. This man did not sound confused. He sounded experienced. Behind Melissa, near the galley curtain, another crew member glanced over. Then another. The atmosphere shifted. Melissa straightened her shoulders. If you continue refusing crew direction, I'll need to involve the purser. Ethan folded the boarding pass once, perfectly even, then placed it gently on the tray table. Please do. No emotion, no threat. And somehow that frightened Melissa more than anger would have. Because for the first time since she approached seat 2A, she felt the smallest crack of uncertainty. Not about the ticket, about him. About the kind of man who stayed this calm while being publicly humiliated in a cabin full of strangers. Outside the aircraft, thunder rolled low across the runway. And 30,000 feet above the storm clouds waiting somewhere beyond Chicago's night sky, a much larger collision had already begun. Melissa turned sharply toward the galley curtain. Laura. Her voice carried farther than she intended. A few passengers flinched slightly. Others stared harder at their phones, pretending they were not listening while hearing every word. The curtain parted almost immediately. Laura Bennett stepped into the aisle with the calm authority of someone who had spent decades controlling uncomfortable situations inside aluminum tubes 30,000 feet above the ground. 49 years old. Silver strands tucked tightly beneath her uniform cap, sharp posture, sharp eyes. The kind of woman passengers trusted instantly, or feared. What's the issue? Laura asked quietly. Melissa lowered her voice, but not enough. Passenger in 2A is disputing service verification, not meal service, not misunderstanding. Verification, the wording mattered. Ethan noticed that immediately. Laura's eyes moved toward him. One glance, quick, professional, measuring. Then to the boarding pass resting on the tray table. Rachel Collins watched the entire exchange over the rim of her reading glasses. Her stomach tightened. She had spent years inside corporate investigations. She knew how language changed once institutions started protecting themselves. Laura stepped closer. Good evening, sir. Ethan nodded politely. Good evening. Melissa tells me there may be some confusion regarding your seat assignment. There isn't. His answer came softly, steady. That somehow unsettled Laura more than anger would have. She picked up the boarding pass carefully. C2A, first class, confirmed purchase. No standby notation, no gate override, no upgrade coding. Perfectly valid. Laura knew it within seconds. But now Melissa stood beside her. Passengers were watching. And somewhere deep beneath years of procedure and polished training, another instinct had already taken hold. People rarely admitted suspicion once they had acted on it publicly. Doing that required humility. And humiliation. Laura handed the pass back. Sometimes our boarding system updates slowly, she said. We just need to make sure the cabin manifest is accurate before departure. Ethan leaned back slightly in his seat. What exactly are you verifying? Laura paused, only half a second, but Rachel noticed. So did the older man in row 3, who had quietly lowered his newspaper minutes earlier. Laura folded her hands. We're simply trying to resolve this smoothly for everyone. Again, not answering the question. Outside the aircraft windows, rain hammered harder against the glass. Ground crew moved beneath flashing orange lights, while the engine turbines hummed low and steady in the darkness. Inside first class, the air felt thinner now. Melissa crossed her arms tightly. This would move much faster if he cooperated. Ethan turned toward her for the first time since Laura arrived. I showed you my ticket.
You challenged crew instructions.
No, Ethan said calmly. I challenged being denied service. That landed harder than anyone expected. A younger passenger near the bulkhead slowly lowered his phone toward his lap. The screen stayed on, recording. Laura noticed. Her pulse quickened. Because once phones appeared, mistakes became evidence. She forced another professional smile. Sir, no one is denying you service. You skipped my meal selection. Laura inhaled carefully through her nose. Until manifest verification is complete. There is no manifest issue. The silence after that felt sharp enough to cut through the cabin. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. Passengers were no longer pretending this was routine. The businessman in 1C finally closed his laptop completely. Rachel Collins removed her glasses and folded them slowly in her lap. Everyone sensed the same thing. This had gone too far. Laura lowered her voice. Sir, I'm asking you respectfully not to escalate this any further. Ethan looked at her steadily. I'm not the one escalating it. A muscle tightened near Laura's jaw.
That sentence hit too close to the truth.
The cockpit door clicked open. Captain Daniel Mercer stepped halfway into the aisle, tall, broad shoulders, gray at the temples, a face worn by decades of weather delays, medical emergencies, mechanical failures, and exhausted passengers. He looked first at Laura. That alone told Ethan something important. Pilots trusted crew reports first. Always. What's going on? Mercer asked quietly. Laura kept her answer polished. Minor seating verification issue. We're handling it. Captain Mercer glanced toward Ethan. Ethan met his eyes without speaking. Something about the calmness bothered him immediately. Passengers causing trouble usually came with noise, frustration, ego, defensiveness. This man had none of that, yet the entire cabin felt locked around him. Melissa stepped forward quickly. He's refusing to cooperate with standard verification procedures. Again, procedures. Verification, compliance language. Ethan noticed every word. Captain Mercer stepped farther into first class now, his polished shoes stopping beside row 2. Sir, he said carefully, I need to understand why departure is being delayed. Ethan's voice stayed low. Because your crew decided my presence in first class required investigation. Melissa's face flushed instantly. That is not what I said. It's exactly what you implied. No one moved. Rachel Collins looked down briefly, not because she disagreed, but because hearing uncomfortable truths spoken aloud always changed a room. Captain Mercer extended one hand slightly. Let's slow this down. Ethan nodded once. I'd be happy to. Mercer looked toward Laura. Does he have a valid ticket? Another pause. Tiny, dangerous. Yes. The captain's eyes narrowed almost invisibly. Then what's the operational concern? Laura answered too quickly. Passenger resistance during cabin verification. Ethan gave the faintest shake of his head. There was no resistance until your crew denied service. Melissa opened her mouth again. Captain Mercer raised one hand without looking at her. She stopped immediately. That silence told Ethan something else. The captain had started realizing the story reaching the cockpit might not be the full one. Outside, thunder rolled across the tarmac. The plane shuddered lightly beneath a burst of wind. Inside the cabin, nobody touched their drinks anymore. Mercer rubbed one hand across his jaw slowly. Sir, he said carefully, would you be willing to step off briefly while we review the manifest? Rachel's eyes snapped toward him instantly. There it was, the soft version of removal. Ethan looked at the captain for a long moment, not angry, not surprised, just tired in the way people become after spending years proving they belong in rooms they already earned the right to enter. Captain, he said quietly, would you be asking the same thing if I looked different? No one breathed. Melissa looked away first. Laura stared straight ahead. And Captain Daniel Mercer suddenly understood something cold and dangerous. There was no good answer to that question, only consequences. Captain Mercer did not answer immediately. Rain rattled harder against the windows beside row 2. Somewhere farther back in economy, an overhead bin slammed shut with a hollow metallic crack. The sound echoed through the cabin like a warning. Ethan watched the captain carefully, not aggressively, not triumphantly, just watching. That made Mercer even more uncomfortable, because the question hanging between them was not really about a seat anymore, or a meal, or a boarding pass. It was about instinct, about assumption, about why certain people had to prove they belonged before anyone offered them dignity. Melissa shifted beside the captain, folding her arms tighter. Captain, we are already delayed. There it was again, the pressure point. Time. Airlines could tolerate complaints. They could tolerate unhappy passengers. But delays cost money. Connections, crew hours, reports. And once operations started slipping, institutions almost always chose speed over fairness. Mercer exhaled slowly. Sir, he said carefully, I'm trying to avoid turning this into a formal security matter. Rachel Collins finally spoke. He hasn't done anything. Her voice cut cleanly through the cabin. Every head turned toward her. Rachel sat upright now, calm but firm, her legal pad still resting across her lap. He showed his ticket twice. Your crew confirmed it's valid. This should have ended 10 minutes ago. Melissa's expression hardened immediately. With respect, Mom, you do not have the full operational picture. Rachel gave a short, humorless laugh. No, I think I do. A few passengers looked away quickly. People hated moments like this. Moments where someone forced the truth into the open after everyone else has silently agreed to avoid it. Captain Mercer glanced toward Laura. Laura kept her face neutral, but inside, the situation was slipping faster than she wanted to admit. Because Rachel had changed something important. Now there was a witness speaking aloud, not recording silently, not whispering, speaking. That mattered. Ethan leaned back slightly in his seat. Captain, he said quietly, do you know why I asked whether you would treat another passenger differently? Mercer rubbed his jaw again. I'm listening, because this is how these situations always begin. Melissa scoffed softly under her breath. Ethan continued anyway, not with insults, not with slurs, with professionalism, verification, procedures, small humiliations wrapped in polite language. The cabin went still. Rachel lowered her eyes for a moment because she knew he was right. She had seen the same mechanism inside law firms, hospitals, banks, country clubs. Nobody announced prejudice anymore. They disguised it. Laura stepped in quickly. Sir, no one here is discriminating against you. Ethan looked at her. Then why was I the only passenger asked to prove I belonged in this cabin? No answer came, not because they lacked words, because every possible answer sounded ugly once spoken aloud. Outside the plane, lightning flashed white across the wet runway. The cabin lights flickered once. Passengers shifted uneasily. Mercer looked toward the cockpit for a brief second. His mind was already calculating consequences. Departure slot, air traffic sequencing, crew timing, passenger complaints. But another calculation had started forming beneath those. Risk, not physical risk, legal risk, public risk, the kind that destroyed careers quietly over months. Melissa sensed the shift immediately. Captain, she said quickly, he has repeatedly challenged crew authority. Ethan shook his head once. No, I challenged your assumption. Melissa's cheeks flushed deep red. You're twisting this, am I? Silence again. The younger man near the bulkhead adjusted his phone lower against his knee. Still recording, Rachel noticed him. So did Laura. Fear moved through her chest now. Cold, sharp. Because if this video reached social media, the context would disappear instantly. People would only see fragments. A black passenger, denied service, threatened with removal. That headline alone could burn through an airline in hours. Mercer seemed to realize the same thing at the exact same moment. He lowered his voice. Let's resolve this calmly. Ethan nodded once. I've been calm since boarding. That was true, and everyone knew it. Melissa suddenly looked smaller standing there beside him, not physically, morally. Because the louder she became, the calmer Ethan appeared, and calmness had started making her look unreasonable. Laura glanced toward the galley curtain, where another crew member stood frozen halfway through preparing drink service. Nobody in first class cared about drinks anymore. Nobody cared about dinner. The entire cabin had narrowed into one question. Who gets believed when dignity collides with authority? Mercer made a decision. Sir, he said carefully, I'm going to ask airport operations to verify the manifest directly at the gate. Melissa relaxed slightly. Laura did too. A compromise, procedure, something official. But Ethan's eyes did not change, meaning security. Mercer hesitated. Standard protocol. Rachel looked openly disturbed now. For a valid ticket holder? Mercer's voice tightened. For a passenger refusing crew direction during departure. There it was, the reframing. Rachel felt it instantly. Ethan had gone from passenger to problem, and everyone in the cabin had just watched the transformation happen in real time. Ethan looked toward the rain outside the window again. Water streamed down the glass in silver ribbons beneath the airport lights. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost tired. You know what the hardest part is, Captain? Mercer stayed silent. It's not being doubted. Ethan folded his hands carefully together. It's watching decent people convince themselves they're still being fair while they do it. Nobody moved. Not Melissa, not Laura, not even Rachel. Because deep down, every adult in that cabin understood something painful. Most injustice did not begin with monsters. It began with ordinary people protecting their comfort. The interphone near the galley buzzed sharply. Laura answered quickly, listened. Then her expression changed. She lowered the receiver slowly and looked toward Captain Mercer. Airport security is already on the way. The words settled over first class like smoke. Airport security is already on the way. Nobody spoke for a second. Then the cabin changed, not loudly, quietly. Passengers straightened in their seats. Eyes shifted, breathing slowed. The atmosphere inside the aircraft tightened the way it does right before turbulence hits. Because security meant this was no longer awkward. Now it was official. Melissa tried to regain control of her posture, but her hands betrayed her. Fingers flexing tightly around a meal tablet pressed against her chest. Rachel Collins watched her carefully. Fear. That was fear now, not confidence. Captain Mercer looked toward Ethan again. "Sir," he said carefully, "I still prefer to resolve this voluntarily." Ethan nodded once. "So would I." The answer sounded sincere. That bothered Mercer even more, because difficult passengers usually fought authority emotionally. They escalated. They demanded. They threatened lawsuits. Ethan did none of that. He simply stayed calm while everyone around him slowly exposed themselves. Laura stepped closer into the aisle. "If you cooperate now," she said softly, "this can remain a simple verification process." Rachel let out a quiet breath through her nose. Even to now, they were still using language to soften what was happening. Verification, compliance, process. Never humiliation, never assumption, never bias. Outside, lightning flashed again. The wet tarmac glowed silver beneath the airport floodlights. Somewhere beyond the aircraft, thunder rolled low enough to vibrate faintly through the cabin floor. The younger man near row 3 adjusted his phone slightly higher. Rachel noticed. Melissa noticed too. Their eyes met for half a second. The same realization passed silently between them. This was already being documented. Captain Mercer looked toward Laura. "How long?" "2 minutes," she answered quietly. Mercer nodded once. Then he crouched slightly beside Ethan's seat, lowering his voice enough to sound personal. "Off the record," he said, "I think this situation got bigger than it needed to." Ethan studied him for a long moment. "You know why situations like this become dangerous, Captain?" Mercer stayed silent. "Because once people publicly question your right to belong somewhere, they become emotionally invested in proving themselves right." Rachel felt that sentence land deep in her chest. Not because it sounded dramatic, because it sounded true. Melissa shifted again. "That's not what happened here." Ethan turned toward her slowly. "Then why am I the only passenger on this aircraft being escorted off for verification despite holding a valid first-class ticket?" Melissa opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Captain Mercer looked away first. That tiny movement did not escape Ethan, or Rachel, or anyone else watching. The interphone buzzed again near the galley. Laura answered quickly, "Yes." Pause. "Yes, send them up." She hung up slowly, then looked toward the front cabin door. The silence afterward felt enormous. Even the rain outside sounded louder now. A few rows back, an elderly couple whispered quietly to each other. The woman shook her head slowly, sadness crossing her face more than anger. Her husband leaned closer and murmured something Rachel barely caught. "Should've ended when he showed the ticket." Exactly. That was the tragedy of moments like this. The correct decision had been available almost immediately, but pride had kept pushing the situation forward. Melissa suddenly spoke again, too quickly. "He challenged crew authority from the beginning." "No," Rachel said firmly. "He challenged being embarrassed in front of an entire cabin." Melissa turned sharply toward her. "With respect, Mom, you were not part of the interactions." Rachel met her stare evenly. "I became part of it the second everyone in this cabin was forced to watch it." That hit harder than yelling would have. Laura stepped between them immediately. "Let's keep emotions out of this." Rachel almost smiled at that. Emotions had been inside this situation from the first moment Melissa saw Ethan sitting in seat 2A. The aircraft door opened. 2 airport security officers stepped inside. Dark uniforms, calm expressions, professional posture. Officer Daniel Ruiz entered first, mid-40s, broad shoulders, controlled eyes that scanned the cabin quickly before settling on row 2. Behind him came Officer Karen Doyle, older, sharper, carrying a small digital incident tablet in one hand. Neither officer looked aggressive. That somehow made the moment feel worse. Professional systems always looked calm while damaging people. Laura approached them first. Passenger compliance concern, she said quietly. Manifest verification, dispute delaying departure. Again, the same framing. Officer Ruiz nodded slowly and approached Ethan. Sir, he said evenly, I'm Officer Ruiz with Airport Operations. We need you to step off the aircraft briefly while we review some documentation. The entire cabin watched Ethan, waiting. Some passengers probably expected anger now, resistance, raised voices. Instead, Ethan calmly reached beneath the seat for his worn leather bag. The motion was slow, careful, almost graceful. Melissa blinked in surprise. Captain Mercer watched him closely. Something about the way Ethan moved suddenly felt wrong to him. Not threatening, not fearful, certain, like a man who already knew how this night would end. Ethan stood, tall, controlled, composed. The cabin somehow felt smaller once he was on his feet. Officer Doyle extended a hand politely toward the aisle.
This way, sir.
Ethan nodded, then paused. His eyes moved slowly across first class, not accusing, not bitter, just looking. At the passengers who stayed silent, at the crew protecting procedure over fairness, at the systems quietly escalating ordinary prejudice into official action. When he finally spoke, his voice remained low enough that people leaned forward to hear it. The hardest thing about dignity, he said softly, is how easy it becomes to take away when everyone around you decides comfort matters more than courage. Nobody moved. Rachel felt heat rise behind her eyes unexpectedly, because deep down, she knew he was talking about more than airlines, more than first class. He was talking about every room where decent people stayed quiet while someone else was slowly diminished in front of them. Officer Ruiz gently motioned again toward the exit. Ethan picked up his bag and walked off the aircraft without resistance. Behind him, first class remained completely silent. Like the cabin itself already understood, it had crossed a line it could not uncross. The jet bridge felt colder than the cabin. Ethan noticed that first. Not the officers beside him, not the sound of the aircraft door closing behind his back, not the faces pressed toward the small oval windows inside first class. The cold, a clean airport cold, dry and mechanical, blowing from vents hidden somewhere above the metal walkway. Officer Ruiz walked slightly ahead of him. Officer Doyle stayed just behind, her incident tablet held close to her chest. Neither touched him, neither rushed him. That mattered. Small things mattered in moments when dignity had already been scraped thin. Behind them, the aircraft door sealed with a soft thud. To the passengers inside, the problem had left. To Ethan, the real problem had finally stepped into the light. At the gate, everything looked too bright, too public. Fluorescent lights washed over the blue carpet, the boarding scanner, the empty stanchions still twisted into neat lanes. Gate agents stood near the counter, with faces carefully arranged into professional concern. A man in a navy blazer hurried over from the podium. "Is this the passenger?" he asked. Officer Ruiz gave him a look. "Let's start with names, please." The man swallowed. "Right, sorry. I'm Brian Keller, gate supervisor." Ethan watched Brian's eyes flick down to his jacket, his bag, his shoes. Quick, automatic, a scan disguised as nothing. Ethan had seen it in hotel lobbies, banks, private clubs, conference centers. People called it observation, but too often it was judgment looking for permission. Officer Doyle tapped her screen. "Mr. Brooks, can we see your identification and boarding pass?" Ethan handed them over, no hesitation. Brian took the boarding pass first. He scanned it at the podium. The machine gave a sharp green beep. Everyone heard it. Valid. Brian's fingers froze above the keyboard. He scanned it again. Another green beep. Officer Ruiz looked at him. "Problem?" Brian cleared his throat. "No. It shows confirmed first class. Seat 2A. Paid fare." Ethan said nothing. That silence did more work than anger ever could. Officer Doyle checked his driver's license against the airline profile. "Ethan Brooks," she read aloud. Brian's expression changed faintly, but not enough. The name touched something in his memory. A memo, maybe, a meeting invite, a compliance training slide he had clicked through too quickly. He looked again. "Your reservation is valid, sir." "I know." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Melissa and Laura stepped out of the aircraft then, followed by Captain Mercer. The captain's face had tightened since the cabin. He looked less like a man in command now, and more like a man walking toward a report he did not want to write. Melissa kept her eyes on the floor. Laura did not. She looked straight at the officers, ready to frame the scene before anyone else could. There was a passenger compliance concern during departure preparation, Laura said. We requested verification to protect cabin integrity. Officer Ruiz turned slowly toward her. Cabin integrity? Laura held her posture.
Yes.
Premium cabin access has to be verified when there is a concern.
What concern?
Laura blinked. For the first time, the phrase did not protect her. It exposed her. Brian looked from Laura to the screen. I'm not seeing any manifest discrepancy. Melissa spoke before she could stop herself. The concern was his presence in first class. The words landed flat. Clean.
Fatal.
Officer Doyle's hand paused above her tablet. Captain Mercer closed his eyes for less than a second. Laura turned sharply. Melissa. But it was too late. Ethan looked at Melissa. Not with hatred, not with satisfaction, with something worse, clarity. My presence, he said softly. Melissa's face flushed. I meant the booking situation. No, Ethan said. You meant what you said. No one defended her. The airport moved around them as if nothing had happened. A family hurried to another gate. A janitor pushed a trash cart past the seating area. A departure announcement echoed from somewhere down the concourse. Ordinary life continued. That was always the cruelest part. A person could be humiliated in public, and the world would still keep boarding on time. Officer Ruiz looked at Captain Mercer. Captain, were you informed the ticket was valid before requesting security review? Mercer's jaw tightened.
Yes.
Were you informed service had been denied before the compliance concern? He looked toward Laura. Laura looked away. No, Mercer said quietly. I was not told that clearly. Rachel Collins appeared in the aircraft doorway behind them. She should not have stepped out. She knew that, but her conscience had already crossed the aisle before her body did. I can confirm it, she said. Everyone turned. Rachel held her purse in one hand and her folded glasses in the other. Her voice shook slightly, but she did not retreat. He was skipped during meal service. He asked a fair question. He showed his ticket. That's when they turned it into a compliance issue. Melissa stared at her. Rachel stared back. There was fear in Rachel's face, but there was also shame. The shame of having waited too long to speak. Ethan saw it and gave her the smallest nod. Not forgiveness, not absolution, acknowledgement. Sometimes that was enough to keep a person standing. Brian Keller typed quickly into the system, then stopped. His face changed. Not confusion now, recognition. He looked at Ethan again, this time, differently. Mr. Brooks, he said slowly, are you connected out to the partner service review team? Laura went still. Captain Mercer looked up. Melissa's lips parted slightly. Ethan did not answer right away. At the far end of the concourse, a man in a dark suit was walking fast toward gate 14. Not running, but close. His badge swung against his jacket with every step. Brian saw him and turned pale. The man reached the gate, breath controlled, eyes fixed on Ethan. Mr. Brooks, he said, straightening at once. I'm Thomas Reed, Senior Airport Operations Manager. He looked briefly at the crew, then back to Ethan. I'm sorry they made you wait. Nobody spoke after that. Not immediately. The airport noise seemed farther away now, muted beneath the heavy silence gathering around gate 14. Thomas Reed stood beside Ethan with the posture of a man who understood exactly how serious the situation had become. Mid-50s. Trim suit. Airport operations badge clipped perfectly straight against his jacket. He did not look at Melissa first, or Laura, or even Captain Mercer. He looked at Ethan. That was what changed everything. People always noticed where respect moved naturally. And suddenly every person standing near the gate realized authority had quietly shifted. Captain Mercer stepped forward carefully. Thomas, he said, keeping his voice measured, perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere private. Thomas finally turned toward him. Yes, he answered calmly, we absolutely should. Melissa felt her stomach tighten. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. No confusion, no uncertainty, no defense of the crew, just controlled damage management. Officer Doyle glanced between them. Can someone explain exactly what's happening? Thomas answered without hesitation. Mr. Brooks serves on the External Partner Compliance Review Board, overseeing customer treatment standards for multiple domestic carriers. The words hit the gate like a pressure drop. Melissa stared. Laura's face lost color so fast it almost looked painful. Captain Mercer went completely still. Even Officer Ruiz blinked once in surprise. Rachel Collins slowly lowered herself into one of the gate chairs nearby, her pulse suddenly pounding harder than before. Not because Ethan had power, because he never once used it. That was what made the whole thing unbearable. Melissa swallowed hard. You're saying he was auditing us? Ethan finally spoke. No, everyone looked at him. I was traveling to New York. Simple, quiet, true. And somehow that answer sounded worse than any setup ever could. Because now there was no escape route left, no trap, no hidden agenda, no ambush. Just ordinary behavior exposed under the wrong light. Thomas looked toward the aircraft window where confused passengers were still seated in his first class. How long has the flight been delayed? Brian checked the screen quickly. 23 minutes. Thomas nodded once, then turned toward Laura. Walk me through exactly what initiated security escalation. Laura tried to regain control of her breathing. There was concern regarding seating legitimacy and premium cabin verification. Thomas looked at the valid boarding pass still resting on the podium. After the ticket was confirmed, Laura hesitated. Melissa answered instead, too fast. He became confrontational. Rachel stood up immediately. No, he didn't. Every eye turned toward her again. Rachel's voice shook now, but she kept speaking anyway. He was calm the entire time. You skipped his meal. You questioned his seat repeatedly. Then you turned it into a compliance issue when he challenged you politely. Melissa looked furious now. Mom, you are not airline personnel. No, Rachel said quietly. I'm just someone who watched decent people humiliate another human being because nobody wanted to admit they were wrong. That one landed hard. Captain Mercer looked away toward the rain-covered windows because somewhere deep inside himself, he knew she was right. Thomas folded his arms slowly. Were any passengers recording the interaction? Silence. Then Brian answered carefully. Yes, at least two visibly. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. That told Ethan everything he needed to know. Not fear of injustice, fear of exposure. The same system that ignored quiet humiliation suddenly became urgent once cameras appeared. Ethan watched the realization move across everyone's faces one by one. Melissa, Laura, Mercer. People always believed systems were strongest when they held authority. But systems were actually most fragile the moment witnesses arrived. Officer Doyle looked toward Ethan carefully now. Mr. Brooks, she said, for the record, did you identify yourself at any point before removal? No. Why not? Ethan glanced toward the aircraft, passengers still waiting, still trapped inside a delayed flight because of one ordinary assumption. Because names should not determine whether people are treated with dignity. Nobody answered that, because there was no defense against it. Thomas pulled out his phone. I'm notifying executive operations. Melissa's face changed instantly. Executive operations, not customer service, not crew relations. Executive operations meant legal exposure, internal review, documentation. Captain Mercer stepped closer. Thomas, before this escalates further, perhaps we can resolve it internally. Thomas looked at him carefully. That opportunity existed 20 minutes ago. The captain flinched slightly, small, but visible. Rainwater rolled slowly down the terminal glass behind them. Blue taxiway lights reflected across the wet concrete outside, while another aircraft lifted into the dark Chicago sky. Life kept moving. But Gate 14 had become frozen inside consequence. Melissa's voice came quieter now. I was trying to protect the premium cabin. Ethan looked at her directly for the first time since leaving the aircraft.
From what?
She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Because saying the truth aloud would destroy her, and everyone already knew it anyway. Rachel sat back down slowly, exhausted now. Her hands trembled slightly against her purse strap. Not from fear, from guilt. The guilt of knowing she had watched too long before speaking. Ethan noticed. You did the right thing eventually, he told her quietly. Rachel gave a weak laugh. Eventually doesn't always feel good enough. No, Ethan admitted softly, but silence feels worse later. That sentence settled deeply inside her. The kind of sentence people carried home after nights they could not forget. Thomas lowered his phone from his ear. They're opening a formal review tonight. Melissa looked stunned. Tonight?
Yes.
Laura stepped forward immediately. Thomas, this can still be corrected. Ethan finally shook his head once. No, he said calmly. Correction happens before security gets called on someone with a valid ticket. Nobody argued with him. because every person standing there knew exactly when this situation could have ended. At the first boarding pass, at the first apology, at the first moment someone chose humility over ego. Instead, they kept choosing procedure over humanity, and now the system itself has started watching. The terminal speakers announced another boarding call somewhere down the concourse, but nobody near gate 14 seemed to hear it anymore. The air had changed. People walking past the gate slowed down now. They sensed tension without understanding it. A delayed flight, airport security, airline management gathering near the podium. Ordinary travelers always noticed trouble, even when they pretended not to. Thomas Reed stepped aside to answer another call, his voice lowered but urgent. Captain Mercer stood near the gate window with both hands on his hips, staring out at the rain like he could somehow rewind the last half hour if he looked hard enough. Melissa remained frozen beside the podium, not angry anymore, not defensive, just unraveling, because now she understood the part nobody tells you when you first wear a uniform with authority attached to it. Small decisions become permanent very quickly. Officer Ruiz looked toward Ethan again. "Would you like to file a formal statement tonight?" Ethan adjusted the strap on his worn leather bag.
I already have.
Ruiz frowned slightly. Ethan glanced toward Thomas. "He knows." Thomas lowered his phone slowly. "Yes," he admitted. "The review request was submitted from the gate 15 minutes ago." Laura's head snapped toward Ethan. "You filed a report while this was happening?" "No," Ethan said calmly. "The system filed it automatically. Nobody understood immediately." Then Brian Keller's face changed. He looked at the boarding system screen again, then at Ethan. "You scanned the QR verification." Ethan nodded once. Rachel Collins blinked in surprise. "What does that mean?" Brian answered quietly, almost to himself. Premium compliance passengers sometimes travel anonymously during active service evaluations. Melissa looked physically sick now. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible." But it was. And suddenly every detail from the night rearranged itself into something far more dangerous. The calmness, the precise language, the refusal to argue emotionally, the questions. Ethan had not escalated anything. He had documented it. Captain Mercer turned away from the window sharply. "You were auditing this flight." Ethan met his eyes evenly. "No, Captain." Then after a small pause, "I was observing whether people still knew how to treat each other when no one important seemed to be watching." The silence afterward felt enormous. Rachel sat perfectly still, because that sentence reached far beyond airports, far beyond airlines. It reached into hospitals, restaurants, banks, schools, all the places where dignity quietly depended on who people believed mattered. Thomas returned to the group. "Corporate legal is joining remotely in 10 minutes. Melissa looked panicked now. "This is insane," she said. "I never used a racial slur. I never insulted him." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know. Then why does everyone keep acting like I did something terrible?" His eyes stayed on hers. "Because dignity can be damaged long before hatred becomes loud." Melissa's breathing became uneven. "I was doing my job," Rachel answered softly from behind them. "No, you were protecting your assumption." Melissa turned sharply toward her again. "You don't know what it's like working flights every day. We deal with scams constantly."
And was he scamming you?
Rachel asked. Melissa said nothing, because she already knew the answer. No fake ticket, no aggressive behavior, no intoxication, no disruption. Just a man who did not match the picture she expected to see in seat 2A. Captain Mercer finally stepped closer to Ethan. His voice had changed now, less defensive, more human. "How long have you been doing these reviews?" 12 years. "And this still happens?" Ethan gave a tired smile that never fully formed. More quietly now. That hit Mercer harder than he expected, because he realized something painful. Everyone on that aircraft believed they were good people. Melissa probably volunteered somewhere. Laura had likely trained younger flight attendants for years. Mercer himself had spent decades protecting passengers safely across storms and emergencies. None of them woke up wanting to humiliate someone. And yet they still did it. That was the danger, not evil people. Ordinary people protecting systems instead of humanity. Thomas's phone buzzed again. He read the screen and cursed softly under his breath. Laura noticed immediately.
What?
Thomas looked up slowly. One of the passenger videos is already online. Melissa grabbed the edge of the podium.
What?
Rachel closed her eyes briefly. Too late. Always too late once the truth reached the public before the institution controlled the narrative. Thomas continued reading. It already has over 50,000 views. Captain Mercer rubbed both hands across his face. The younger passenger with the phone. Of course, a short clip would spread fast. A calm black passenger, first class. Security called, valid ticket. The internet would fill the missing details on its own within minutes. Laura straightened quickly. We need a statement immediately. Thomas looked at her sharply. No, we need honesty immediately. That sentence landed like a slap. For the first time all night, Laura had no professional response ready. Officer Doyle stepped toward Ethan. You understand this is going to become public. Ethan nodded. I know. You seem very calm about that. Ethan looked through the rain-streaked terminal windows toward the aircraft still sitting motionless at the gate. I'm calm because this stopped being about me the moment security was called. Rachel felt that deep in her chest. Because he was right. This story no longer belonged to one passenger or one crew. It belonged to every person who had ever been quietly humiliated while others watched in silence. Melissa's voice broke slightly now. I really thought I was following procedure. Ethan finally looked at her with something softer in his expression. Not anger, not pity, sadness. That's what should scare you most. She stared at him. Why? Because systems become dangerous when people stop noticing the difference between policy and humanity. Nobody moved. The rain kept falling outside. The aircraft remained grounded. And somewhere inside first class, untouched meal trays were still waiting for passengers who no longer felt quite as comfortable in their seats as they had an hour earlier. The conference room near terminal operations smelled faintly of burnt coffee and wet coats. Rain tapped steadily against the long glass windows overlooking the runway, while airport employees moved silently beyond the walls, carrying folders, tablets, and paper cups they had long forgotten to drink from. Nobody in the room looked comfortable. Melissa sat rigid near the far end of the table, both hands wrapped tightly around each other in her lap. Laura stared down at a printed incident report she had not turned a single page of in nearly 10 minutes. Captain Mercer remained standing beside the windows, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the aircraft still parked motionless at Gate 14. Flight 287 had now been delayed almost 1 hour. Not because of weather, because of people. Thomas Reed placed another phone face down on the table. It was the third one vibrating nonstop in the last few minutes. Corporate communications wants a timeline, he said. Nobody answered. Officer Doyle sat quietly near the door, reviewing body camera notes from the gate interaction. Every few seconds, she glanced toward Ethan with the same measured curiosity she had carried since learning who he was. Not celebrity curiosity, professional curiosity. The kind that came when someone remained calm in situations designed to strip calm away. Ethan sat alone near the middle of the room. His leather bag rested beside his chair exactly where he placed it. His jacket remained buttoned despite the heat. He looked tired now, not broken, just tired. The kind of exhaustion people carried after years of watching the same lesson repeat itself in different buildings with different uniforms. Thomas finally sat down across from him. For the record, he said quietly, you were never formally flagged for active observation tonight. Melissa looked up sharply. Laura did too, Thomas continued. You were traveling as a private passenger. Ethan nodded once. That's correct. Captain Mercer turned from the window. Then how did the automatic report trigger? Ethan folded his hands slowly. Your airline recently implemented anonymous premium experience monitoring. Laura's face tightened immediately. She remembered the training memo now. Most crew ignored it because corporate programs came and went constantly, but Ethan remembered every word. When my boarding pass was rescanned during a security escalation, he continued calmly. The system automatically generated a level 3 compliance notification. Thomas rubbed his forehead, which immediately alerted executive review. Melissa looked like she might be sick. No one told us level 3 could activate from a passenger removal. Ethan looked at her gently. That's because it normally requires multiple procedural failures happening together. Nobody moved after that, because now the shape of the disaster became fully visible. Not one mistake. A chain. Meal denial, repeated verification, public questioning, security escalation despite valid credentials. One poor decision feeding the next until the system itself finally intervened. Rachel Collins sat quietly near the wall with a paper cup of untouched coffee cooling between her hands. She had been asked to remain as a witness statement provider. She still looked disturbed, not dramatic, not emotional. Disturbed in the deeper way adults become when they realize how easily decent environments can slide into cruelty without anyone raising their voice. Thomas looked toward Melissa carefully. Walk me through the first moment you became suspicious. Melissa swallowed hard. Everyone in the room waited. Even she seemed afraid of her own answer. I don't know, she admitted quietly. Ethan watched her without speaking. Melissa stared down at the table. She stopped. No one rescued her sentence. Captain Mercer finally spoke softly. He didn't fit the expectation. The room went silent again, because honesty had finally entered. Ugly, late, but honest. Melissa's eyes filled immediately. I know how that sounds. Rachel answered before anyone else could.
It sounds human.
Melissa looked up at her in confusion. Rachel continued slowly. Wrong, but human. That changed the room, not forgiveness. Perspective, because monsters were easy to condemn. Ordinary people were harder. Ordinary people made systems dangerous, precisely because they rarely believed they were doing harm. Officer Doyle closed her tablet. In law enforcement, she said quietly, we train constantly against assumption bias. Because once suspicion starts emotionally, people unconsciously search for evidence to justify it afterward. Laura leaned back slowly in her chair. That's exactly what happened on the aircraft. No one argued. Because now that the tension had broken, everyone could finally see the sequence clearly. The ticket should have ended it. But Melissa's suspicions survived the facts. Then Laura protected the crew instead of questioning the assumption. Then Mercer protected departure procedure. And suddenly an innocent passenger became a compliance concern. Not through hatred, through momentum. Ethan looked around the room carefully. You know what the hardest part of reviews like this is? Nobody answered. Most people expect me to uncover cruelty. His voice stayed calm. But usually I uncover fear. Thomas frowned slightly. Fear of what? Ethan looked toward the rain outside. Fear of admitting someone was judged unfairly. That landed deeply inside every person there. Because admitting unfairness requires something institutions hated. Vulnerability. Melissa wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed. I really thought I was protecting standards. Ethan nodded slowly. I believe you. She looked up in surprise. Then why does this feel so terrible? Ethan's answer came softly. Because intent does not erase impact. The room fell silent once more. Outside the windows, another plane lifted through the storm clouds into the dark Chicago sky. Its lights disappeared almost immediately into the rain. Rachel stared at the runway for a long moment before speaking quietly. My father used to say dignity is easiest to defend when it costs nothing. Everyone looked toward her. She gave a tired smile. But the real test is whether you defend it when it becomes inconvenient. Captain Mercer lowered his eyes, because that was exactly where all of them had failed. The delay, the pressure, the departure clock. Convenience had become more important than one man's humanity. Thomas's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and exhaled slowly. The video passed 3 million views. Nobody reacted immediately. The number felt unreal, but Ethan barely looked surprised, because public attention was never really the shocking part. The shocking part was how many people recognized themselves in stories like this once they saw them happen out loud. By midnight, the airport no longer felt like an airport. It felt like a courtroom nobody had prepared for. Phones kept vibrating across the conference table. Legal teams, corporate executives, media inquiries. Internal compliance officers suddenly awake and deeply interested in details they had ignored for years. The rain outside had finally slowed, but the storm inside terminal operations had only grown heavier. Flight 287 remained grounded. Passengers had been rebooked. Some were angry. Most were confused. A few had already recognized Ethan from screenshots spreading online beside headlines that changed every few minutes. First-class passenger escorted off plane, despite valid ticket. Airline faces bias investigation after a viral video. Premium passenger removed during meal service dispute. Every headline missed something important. The meal never mattered. Thomas Reed sat at the end of the table, reviewing the latest statement draft from corporate communications. His tie hung loose now. The exhaustion in his face looked older than the evening itself. They want to issue an apology immediately, he said. Captain Mercer gave a tired nod. They should. Thomas looked toward Ethan. They want to apologize publicly to you by name. Ethan shook his head almost instantly. No, that surprised everyone. Melissa looked up slowly. Thomas frowned. Why not? Because this was never only about me. The room quieted again. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. If the statement only apologizes because I happen to hold influence, then the lesson gets lost. Officer Doyle watched him carefully. Most people in Ethan's position would have wanted consequences first. Headlines, accountability, public humiliation. But Ethan seemed focused on something larger. Systems, patterns. The invisible damage done long before stories reached the news. Rachel Collins sat beside the windows now, staring down at the dark runway lights glowing across the wet pavement. She had called her daughter an hour earlier to say she would be home late. She still had not fully processed what she witnessed. Not the argument. The silence around it. That was the part haunting her most. The way intelligent adults watched a man slowly lose dignity one polite sentence at a time. Melissa suddenly spoke again, quieter than before. My father worked airport security for 30 years. Nobody interrupted her. He used to tell me the biggest danger in this job is getting too comfortable making fast judgments. She swallowed hard. I thought I understood what he meant. Ethan looked at her calmly. And now? Melissa stared down at her trembling hands. Now, I think comfort is exactly what caused this. No one argued, because she was finally telling the truth. Comfort with assumption. Comfort with authority. Comfort with letting procedure overpower empathy. Captain Mercer sat heavily into one of the empty chairs. I keep replaying the moment you asked me whether I would react differently if you looked different. He rubbed his face slowly. I knew there was no good answer. But I still kept following the process anyway. Ethan nodded once. That's how systems fail. Mercer looked up, not through hate. Usually not, Ethan answered softly. Usually through people choosing the safest professional path instead of the bravest human one. That sentence settled heavily over the room. Thomas's phone buzzed again. He ignored it this time. Outside the conference room, airport employees moved quietly through the late-night terminal, carrying cleaning supplies and closing reports. The airport itself was beginning to empty, but inside the room, nobody felt finished. Officer Ruiz leaned against the doorway with folded arms. You know what bothers me most? He said. Everyone looked toward him. We responded, because the call used the words, passenger compliance concern. He shook his head slowly. The moment certain phrases enter the system, everybody downstream assumes the passenger is the problem before they even arrive. Laura finally spoke after nearly 20 minutes of silence. And we created that language. Her voice sounded hollow. Rachel looked toward her. Laura stared at the table. We turned discomfort into procedure, then procedure into escalation. Ethan did not answer. He did not need to. She already understood. Thomas exhaled slowly. The board wants immediate suspension recommendations by morning. Melissa closed her eyes. Captain Mercer looked toward her briefly, not defending, not condemning, just exhausted. Because everyone in that room had finally realized something painful. Punishment alone would not solve this. The deeper issue lived underneath policy manuals and training videos. It lived inside reflex, inside assumption, inside the split-second calculations people made about who belonged in certain spaces. Rachel stood slowly from her chair. When I was young, she said quietly, my mother cleaned hotel rooms outside Detroit. The room turned toward her. She used to tell me something after difficult days. Rachel smiled sadly. She said the fastest way to reveal character is to give somebody tiny amounts of power over strangers. Melissa looked down immediately. Rachel continued gently. Not because power creates cruelty, because it reveals what people already believe about who deserves respect. Nobody spoke after that. The silence felt earned now, not defensive, reflective. Thomas finally slid the drafted public statement across the table toward Ethan. Then, tell us what should be said. Ethan looked at the paper for several seconds without touching it. Then he answered quietly.
Tell the truth.
Thomas waited. Ethan's eyes moved slowly around the room. Tell people a valid passenger was denied dignity long before he was denied service. Melissa's breathing caught slightly. Tell them no racial slur was spoken. Laura lowered her eyes. Tell them the danger came from ordinary assumptions, repeated confidently. Captain Mercer stared out toward the sleeping runway. And tell them, Ethan finished softly, that policies mean nothing if humanity disappears the moment someone seems different from what you expected. Nobody moved. Because deep down, every person in that room knew the statement was no longer just about an airline. It was about the kind of country people quietly created every day through small decisions nobody thought mattered until it was too late. By 2 a.m, the airport had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists after long storms and longer nights. Most of the terminal lights had dimmed. Cleaning crews moved slowly across polished floors with heavy carts and tired eyes. Somewhere far down the concourse, a floor machine hummed softly like distant thunder fading away. Inside the conference room, nobody looked the same anymore. Melissa sat with both hands wrapped around a paper cup that had gone cold nearly an hour earlier. Laura's uniform jacket rested across the back of her chair now, the sharp authority she wore so comfortably earlier in the night, stripped away piece by piece. Captain Mercer stood alone near the window again, staring at the empty gate where Flight 287 should have departed long ago. Thomas Reed had spent the last hour moving between calls with executives, legal advisors, and operations directors. Each conversation made the situation feel larger, not louder, heavier, because the deeper they investigated, the worse the pattern became. More complaints, more reports, more passengers quietly describing moments that sounded painfully familiar, not dramatic incidents. Small ones, cold looks, extra questioning, different treatment, polite humiliation wrapped in professional language. The kind of things easy to dismiss one at a time, until they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Ethan stood near the coffee station, pouring himself fresh coffee slowly, carefully, like a man who had done this exact routine in 100 airports before. Officer Doyle watched him for a moment. You travel alone often? Ethan nodded, most of the time. Even knowing situations like this can happen. He gave a faint smile. Especially because situations like this can happen. That answer stayed with her. Because she understood what he meant. People only reveal their instincts when they think no consequences are attached. Rachel Collins walked over quietly and stood beside Ethan near the windows. The city lights beyond the runway glowed faint gold through the rain-streaked glass. I keep thinking about something, she admitted softly. Ethan looked toward her. I almost stayed quiet. He did not answer immediately. Rachel shook her head slowly. I saw it happening. I knew something was wrong, but part of me kept thinking maybe someone else would say something first. That's human, Ethan said gently. Rachel laughed once under her breath. That word has sounded very complicated tonight. He nodded. Because people think humanity is measured by intention. His eyes moved toward the dark terminal outside, but usually it's measured by action. Rachel looked down at the floor. My daughter teaches 3rd grade. She smiled sadly. She tells her students that kindness is not real if it only appears when it's easy. Ethan took a slow sip of coffee. She sounds wiser than most adults. Across the room, Thomas finally ended another phone call and looked toward everyone gathered there. They've suspended the crew pending formal review. Melissa lowered her eyes immediately. Laura sat perfectly still. Captain Mercer closed his eyes briefly. No one argued, not because they agreed with punishment alone, because the understood consequences had already started long before corporate decisions arrived. Melissa suddenly stood from her chair. I need to say something. The room turned toward her. Her breathing trembled slightly, but she stayed standing. When I first saw Mr. Brooks sitting in first class tonight, she stopped, swallowing hard. I made a judgment before I ever spoke to him. Nobody interrupted. Melissa wiped quickly beneath one eye. I told myself I was being observant, professional, careful. Her voice cracked slightly. But the truth is, I decided he didn't belong there before I checked a single fact. The room remained silent, not hostile, just honest, because everyone there knew how difficult real honesty actually was. Melissa looked directly at Ethan now. I think the scariest part is realizing how normal it felt in the moment. Ethan held her gaze calmly. That's why these situations matter. She nodded slowly. Not because people are always hateful, because people stop questioning themselves. Captain Mercer finally turned away from the windows. For 30 years, he said quietly, I thought professionalism meant protecting the process. He looked down at his hands. Tonight I realized that professionalism without humanity is just polished indifference. Thomas leaned back heavily into his chair. That line is probably ending up in the final report. For the first time all night, a few tired smiles appeared around the room. Small, exhausted, human. Outside the conference room, dawn was beginning to touch the edges of the Chicago skyline with pale blue light. The storm had finally passed. Ground crews prepared another aircraft at a nearby gate. Baggage carts rolled slowly beneath blinking runway lights. The airport was waking up again. Life moved forward. It always did. Ethan picked up his leather bag from beside the table. Thomas stood immediately. We can arrange a private car and another flight to New York. Ethan nodded politely. Thank you. Melissa stepped forward carefully before he could leave. I know an apology doesn't erase what happened. No, Ethan answered softly, but understanding why it happened matters. She lowered her eyes. I'll remember this night for the rest of my life. Ethan adjusted the strap on his bag. That means it mattered. Then he walked toward the conference room door. Not angry, not triumphant, not defeated, just quiet. The kind of quiet carried by people who understand that real power is not making others feel small. It is making people finally see what they refused to see before. Rachel watched him disappear down the terminal hallway beneath the early morning lights. And for the first time since boarding Flight 287, the entire night finally made sense. One man had entered the aircraft looking ordinary, but dignity had been sitting in seat 2A the entire time. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us how much simple respect still matters in this world. And in the comments, write these 3 words: never stay silent.